Coming up next, BookTV presents Afterwards, an hour-long discussion between a guest host and the author of a new book. This week, University of Minnesota professor and historian Elaine Tyler May talks about her book, America and the Pill, which chronicles the history and impact of the birth control pill in the U.S. Professor May argues the most important change brought about by the pill was for married couples, making it possible for women to plan careers. Elaine Tyler May is interviewed by Christina Hoff Sommers, scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and author of The Science on Women and Science.
I'm Christina Hoff Sommers, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and this is Afterwards. And today I'm going to be talking with University of Minnesota professor Elaine Tyler May, who's going to tell us about her book on the history of the birth control pill. It's called America, the Pill, and there's a lot to talk about, so let's jump right in. First thing I want to ask you is, there were extravagant expectations about the impact the pill was going to have on American society, on the world at large. Its promoters thought it would end poverty, that it would, that marriages would become happy, divorce would become rare, that there would be just a panacea. There were some who even thought it would stop communism. Well, what was the impact of the pill, and what turned out to be the impact? It was less revolutionary than they expected, but what did happen?
Well, you know, in some ways it was even more revolutionary than they expected, depending on where you're looking. But it's certainly true that the pill was greeted with these wildly utopian expectations, you know, that it would bring down the population rate around the world, that it would erase poverty, and people could live comfortably and become good consumers and good capitalists, and it would end the Cold War. And
right, it was going to end the Cold War.
Yeah, right. And that, of course, there would be no more unwanted babies, so there'd be no more unwed pregnancy, and there'd be no more divorce because couples would be so happy since they weren't worrying about having children all the time.
Right.
And most of those expectations, we know now, were not realistic, although some of them, to some extent, were. Certainly it's true that the birth control pill had a huge impact on particularly American families and Western middle-class families, those who had access to the medical care and could afford to get on the pill. Especially for married women, it was unquestionably fantastic. Mm-hmm. And the two people who really had the most realistic and revolutionary expectations, if you think about it in terms of women's lives, were the two women who were really responsible for the pill, the two who I consider to be the mothers of the birth control pill. And that was Margaret Sanger, who was, of course, a lifetime birth control advocate and leader of the birth control movement, and her friend and colleague in women's rights, Katharine McCormick. Now, in the 1950s, they were both in their 70s. Certainly the pill was not going to do them any good personally in their own lives anymore. However, they had had a dream for many, many years about a birth control pill, starting really in the early 20th century, when they had gotten to be friends during the suffrage movement. So finally, in the 1950s, McCormick was a widow. She was very wealthy. She had been married to the son of Cyrus McCormick of the International Harvester Company, and she had access to a lot of resources. So she came to Margaret Sanger and said, let's just do this. And they were the ones who found Gregory Pincus and John Rock and the major scientists and clinical researchers who actually developed the pill. Mm-hmm. And worked then with the pharmaceuticals. But it was Margaret Sanger and Katharine McCormick's vision, and then it was Katharine McCormick's money. A lot of people don't realize pharmaceutical companies were terrified of the pill. They didn't want to invest in it. They didn't put a penny into it because they thought, you know, this is a little bit unseemly, and it's quite possible that we might get a boycott from the Catholic Church and no one would buy our products. And
but Cyril Pharmaceuticals eventually did take it on, and they were,
did,
to their credit, because they thought they could be destroyed by this, but
they did.
Yeah,
but not in the very beginning.
No, in the beginning
it was really Katharine McCormick's money that got the ball rolling.
I just have one question about why you say it has mothers, but at some point you say no fathers.
Well, it had many fathers.
It had many fathers.
Sure.
And typically, if someone invented it, it was Gregory Pincus, I suppose we'd call the father, but you'd also want to include Carl Gerasi, and then there was John Rock.
Right.
There was a group of them that came together.
That's right.
And I just guess I'd see it as men and women worked together and made this happen.
Absolutely. I have no quarrel with that. It's just that it couldn't have happened without Katharine McCormick's money in the beginning. And they were the ones really who brought that team together and allowed them to begin the research that would actually yield the
they
pill.
were pioneers. They were innovators, visionaries. Tell me a little more about Margaret Sanger, because she's a complex figure.
She is a very complex figure. Coming out of the early 20th century, the women's rights movement, the socialist movement, she was very radical, and she saw the birth control effort as a way to really liberate women from the shackles, as she saw it, of constant childbearing, especially poor women. She was
working in the slums. She saw
That's right.
close up the miseries.
Yes, and she writes in her autobiography of visiting this poor woman who had something like, well, her own mother, I think, had something like 11 children and died in her early 50s. So she was very passionate about this issue. And then as a visiting nurse, she found these women over and over again who were dying from either illegal abortions or having too many children. And this just became the passion of her life, to try to help women have access to birth control so that they could control their fertility and really save their lives and their health.
Now, before the pill, there was the diaphragm.
Yes.
And women were controlling their fertility. If we look at fertility rates, we see that Americans in the 30s probably had some of the lowest fertility rate. Next to the French, we had the lowest, I think I read. So women were doing something. And and it was somewhat effective.
Well, women
in fact,
were
the diaphragm can be very effective.
Absolutely.
And Margaret Sanger promoted that.
Oh, yes. And in fact, Katharine McCormick smuggled diaphragms into the country from Europe for Margaret Sanger's clinics before the pill in the 20s and the 30s. And, women have been controlling their fertility, and men too, for centuries.
Well, probably forever.
Yeah, probably forever.
I think that goes back to ancient Egypt. There are manuals on birth control, at least mentions of birth control.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what was the pill? What did the pill bring that the diaphragm did not?
The single most revolutionary thing about the pill was that it separated contraception from the act of sexual intercourse. And what that meant was, for the first time ever, and Margaret Sanger and Katharine McCormick really understood what this meant, for the first time ever, women would have total control of contraception. The men that they had sex with didn't need to participate or cooperate or even know about it.
And a lot of the men liked that, because for couples it could be more spontaneous, and go running and putting on the diaphragm. It might be a mood changer.
Not to mention that it frees men of the responsibility of worrying about it.
And it frees women because it's so safe that you don't have the fear of being pregnant, which is not always very encouraging at that time. So I think it was is it safer than the diaphragm?
Well, if it's used properly.
Yeah, that's always the question.
And if the diaphragm is used properly, it's almost as safe and effective as the pill.
Now, just to go back to Margaret Sanger, she wanted to help women, and she had, lots of admirable motives. But then she did seem to move into the eugenicist movement. Many people did, and we don't want to be presentist and see it today the way it was then. It looked very different after the Second World War. But before the Second World War, she was a very active member of this group. And how did that happen, and what was that all about?
Well, Margaret Sanger has been criticized heavily for this, and deservedly so. And some people feel that she sold out because she had been this radical socialist feminist, and then she starts kind of embracing this eugenic vision. There's two ways to look at it. One is that Margaret Sanger was a real political operative. She knew that birth control was an uphill battle, that the way to get legitimacy was through the medical profession, that doctors were going to make it possible for the birth control movement to move forward. She couldn't do it on a parallel track. She learned that. And that eugenics was becoming very popular in the medical community. It's also important to realize that for a time, eugenics was also very popular in the reform and radical community. Emma Goldman was a eugenicist.